You're a Disney fan, so naturally when someone asks which one you've seen, you say all of them. But have you? And if you have, how long did it take? Disney has a long history of producing feature films that stretch all the way back to the 1930s, and since then the studio has tallied up a list of nearly 400 films. So how long would it take to watch all of them? Well, first we need to clarify what counts as a Disney movie. This list accounts for films released under the Walt Disney Pictures banner. That means it doesn't account for Disney's various subsidiary studios over the years like Touchstone, Miramax, Marvel, or Lucasfilm. However, it does account for the early and later Pixar films since they were released under the Disney banner. It also includes all of the documentaries, live-action films, and animated films produced by Disney since they began with Snow White and the Seven Dwarves in 1937. So how long would it take? A long time. At 384 films over nearly 80 years, the total runtime of every Disney movie comes out to 36,918 minutes. That's nearly 26 days of non-stop viewing without any breaks. But how does that break down? More interesting than runtime, in my opinion, is how the number of films per decade changed over the years and reflected Disney history. The 1930s were easy. In 1937, Walt Disney took his first step into the feature film business with the classic Snow White and the Seven Dwarves. It would be the only feature film he made that decade, but it'd be far from the last. Total time to watch the Disney films of the 30s? 83 minutes. The 1940s would see a total of 14 Disney films, including Pinocchio, Fantasia, Dumbo, and Bambi. By today's standards, a little over one movie a year doesn't seem like much for a studio, but considering Disney spent much of the decade in the midst of World War II, which resulted in an understaffed studio that was also working on propaganda shorts for the US government, it was still pretty impressive. Total time to watch all 14 of the 1940s Disney films? 17 hours and 52 minutes. That number would again increase in the 1950s to 29 films. The decade is home to classics like Cinderella, Alice in Wonderland, along with many live-action classics like 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea and Old Yeller. The time to watch all 29 films? 1 day, 16 hours, 24 minutes. By the 1960s, Disney was at the top of their game with film, increasing the total for the decade yet again to 51 films. It was a decade that brought us 101 Dalmatians, The Parent Trap, Mary Poppins, and The Jungle Book. Unfortunately, it would also be the last decade in which the studio and company was headed by Walt. All 51 movies clock in at nearly 86 hours. The 1970s would be the first decade of what I like to call the What Would Walt Do era. Disney leadership was frozen by the lack of Walt, and without his creative leadership, the studio, rather than growing, just stayed the course. The 70s tallied in at 47 films, 4 less than the previous decade. And while it still contained some classics like Robin Hood, Pete's Dragon, and The Rescuers, most became relatively obscure. However, if you wanted to watch them all, it would take you 73 hours. If the 70s was an era of Disney staying the course, the 80s was a decade of decline. Perhaps one of the only notable films of the first 4 years was Tron, which at the time wasn't considered a success by Disney. However, in the mid-1980s, leadership at the Disney company was replaced with Michael Eisner and Frank Wells, who were responsible for turning the company around from a point of potentially being taken over and broken up to the powerhouse that it is today. At 28 films total, the list is short, but it's also worth pointing out that this was the era in which we started to see other studios open under the Disney company, such as Touchstone Pictures. In any case, watching all 28 films from the decade would only take you 44 hours and 17 minutes. Michael Eisner famously crowned the 1990s as the Disney decade, and he sure did mean it. Even without counting films from Touchstone, Dimension, Miramax, or other subsidiaries, the film count for Disney Pictures ballooned to 68 films, more than any other decade before it. If I were to go through all of the memorable films of the 1990s, this video would be twice as long. Part of the reason this list grew so long was due to a strategy Eisner called hitting singles and doubles. Rather than invest large amounts of money into event films that had to do extremely well to turn a profit, Eisner focused on bringing in smaller films under budget so that even a modest turnout at the box office would result in profits for Disney. The plan worked and helped grow Disney into an international media behemoth. Time to watch all 68 films? 107.5 hours. The aughts saw yet another change of leadership from Eisner to the now CEO Bob Iger. It also saw continued growth. At 87 films over 10 years, the company was releasing 8 to 9 movies a year. It was also when we began to see film franchises spring up, such as Pirates of the Caribbean. You're going to want to set aside nearly 141 hours, which is almost 6 solid days if you want to watch everything from that list. Which brings us to now. While we're only 6 years into the decade, the company has put out 59 films to date, which puts it on track to at the very least match the kind of numbers we saw in the last decade. It's important to note, though, that this decade has seen the explosion of Marvel films, as well as the beginning of a new life for Star Wars. So while we might see the Disney Pictures list level off, the Disney company's list as a whole is bound to get larger. It'll take you 103.5 hours, or a bit over 4 days, for you to watch everything from this decade. So there you have it. Maybe you've seen a lot of these, maybe you've seen all of them. Either way, Disney has an impressive and varied roster of films that spans nearly 80 years and has a history onto itself. Thank you all for watching, and I'll see you next time.
Good.